High above Tokyo on that crisp November morning in 1944, Lieutenant Yamamoto strained against his harness, pushing his Mitsubishi Zero to its absolute limits. The engine coughed and wheezed in the thin air at 28,000 feet, ice crystals forming on his canopy as he desperately climbed toward the American bombers floating serenely above him. Through his frozen breath fogging the glass, he could see them, 111 massive Boeing B-29 Superfortresses cruising at 33,600 feet, as unreachable as the moon itself. This moment would haunt Japanese pilots for the remainder of the war, marking the beginning of a technological nightmare that would transform aerial combat forever. The mathematics of defeat were being written in contrails across the stratosphere. Operation San Antonio, the first large-scale B-29 raid on Tokyo, targeted the Nakajima aircraft plant on the city's outskirts, but the target mattered less than the devastating revelation it brought. These American bombers operated in a dimension that Japanese technology simply could not contest. While Yamamoto and his fellow pilots pushed their fighters beyond safe limits, struggling desperately to climb above 30,000 feet, the B-29s cruised effortlessly at altitudes where Japanese interceptors could barely function, dropping their deadly cargo from heights that Japanese anti-aircraft guns could never reach. What Japanese military leaders had dismissed as American propaganda was proving devastatingly real. The B-29 Superfortress represented not merely another bomber, but a revolutionary weapon system that operated in an untouchable realm. For pilots like Yamamoto, tasked with defending their homeland, this revelation would evolve from a tactical challenge into psychological trauma as they repeatedly failed to reach enemies floating serenely above them, watching helplessly as their cities burned below. The path to this moment of reckoning had begun months earlier when American forces captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Mariana Islands during June 1944. Japanese military intelligence immediately grasped the terrifying implications of these strategic victories. From these bases, the B-29s could reach every major Japanese city and return safely to their island fortresses. The homeland that had never been successfully invaded now lay naked and exposed to attack from the air, vulnerable to an enemy that could strike with impunity from altitudes beyond Japanese reach. The B-29 program had consumed $3 billion, more than even the Manhattan Project's $2 billion budget, and each aircraft incorporated revolutionary technologies that seemed like science fiction to Japanese engineers. Pressurized crew compartments allowed American airmen to work in shirt-sleeve comfort at extreme altitudes where Japanese pilots gasped for oxygen through primitive masks. Centralized fire control systems with analog computers directed multiple gun turrets with lethal precision, while the mighty Radar 3,350 engines with turbochargers maintained full power where other engines gasped for air in the stratosphere's thin atmosphere. The first B-29 to reach the Marianas was Jolton Josie, the Pacific Pioneer, which landed on Saipan on October 12, 1944, with General Hansel at the controls. Brigadier General Haywood S. Possum Hansel Jr. had assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command on August 28, bringing extensive experience in strategic bombing planning and an unwavering belief in the power of high-altitude precision bombing. The specifications of his new command told a stark story that would doom Japanese air defense efforts from the start. The B-29's maximum tested ceiling reached 40,600 feet, with an operational ceiling of 33,600 feet where crews could work effectively for hours. Japanese fighters, by contrast, struggled to exceed 30,000 feet under combat conditions, and even reaching that altitude left them vulnerable and nearly helpless. The famous Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's most celebrated fighter, had theoretical ceiling figures that varied by model, but in combat configuration with full fuel and ammunition, rarely operated effectively above 30,000 feet. The disparity wasn't measured in mere hundreds of feet. It was a chasm of several thousand feet that might as well have been several thousand miles. On November 1, 1944, an F-13 photo reconnaissance variant of the B-29 from the 3rd Photographic Reconnaissance Squadron overflew Tokyo, becoming the first American aircraft over the city since the famous Doolittle raid of 1942. This reconnaissance flight revealed the complete inability of Japanese air defenses to intercept high-altitude intruders, providing American planners with crucial intelligence while delivering a psychological blow to Japanese morale. Citizens watched helplessly as the lone American aircraft circled their capital with impunity, photographing targets for future destruction while their defenders remained earthbound, unable to climb high enough to engage. Further F-13 sorties during early November gathered intelligence on aircraft factories and port facilities in the Tokyo-Yokohama area. These reconnaissance aircraft were generally able to evade the heavy anti-aircraft fire they attracted, and the large numbers of Japanese fighters scrambled to intercept them. The scene became grimly routine. Radar operators would detect incoming aircraft, fighter squadrons would scramble from airfields around Tokyo, and pilots would climb frantically toward contacts they could never reach, watching American aircraft complete their missions and depart unscathed. When November 24th arrived, General Emmett O'Donnell led his force of 111 B-29s against the Nakajima aircraft factory in a raid that would shock Japanese defenders to their core. The formation came in at 30,000 feet, where the superfortresses were much safer from Japanese anti-aircraft fire, their aluminum bodies glinting in the morning sun like untouchable silver birds. Japanese radar detected the incoming formation from 200 miles away, providing ample warning that only served to emphasize the defenders' helplessness. Fighter squadrons scrambled from airfields around Tokyo, their pilots knowing they faced a climbing battle against both altitude and time, a battle they were destined to lose. The tactical results of the raid shocked Japanese defenders, though not in the way American planners had hoped. Only 48 bombs struck anywhere near the factory as jet stream winds and clouds made accurate bombing impossible from such heights. Yet this tactical failure mattered far less than the strategic revelation it provided. Japanese fighters could not effectively intercept the bombers. Most interceptors never reached the B-29's altitude, and those few that managed the climb arrived with engines overheating, controls sluggish from the thin air, and only minutes of fuel remaining for combat before being forced to break off and glide back to base. The Nakajima Ki-84 Heian, one of Japan's newest and best fighters, possessed an operational ceiling that theoretically enabled it to intercept B-29s, but this assumed perfect conditions, reduced fuel load, and high-quality aviation fuel that Japan no longer possessed. In the harsh reality of combat operations, most Japanese fighters became combat ineffective above 25,000 feet, leaving them thousands of feet short of their targets. The disparity in operational ceilings created unprecedented challenges for Japanese air defense that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. It wasn't simply that B-29s could fly higher than Japanese fighters. They maintained full combat effectiveness at altitudes where Japanese aircraft could barely function. The Mitsubishi is-6M0 had a listed service ceiling of 36,250 feet, but this figure was achievable only under perfect conditions with minimal fuel and ammunition. Combat reports consistently showed that Zeros rarely operated effectively above 30,000 feet, and attempts to intercept B-29s at their cruising altitude typically ended in failure, frustration, and sometimes tragedy as pilots pushed their aircraft beyond safe limits. The B-29s maintained their full combat capability at operational altitudes through revolutionary design features that seemed almost magical to Japanese engineers studying the wreckage of crashed aircraft. Their pressurized cabins meant American crews operated in comfortable conditions while Japanese pilots suffered from extreme cold and oxygen deprivation at altitudes that left them barely conscious. The temperature at 33,000 feet could plummet to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and Japanese pilots lacked adequate heating systems or proper cold weather gear for extended high-altitude operations. Many returned from interception attempts with frostbite, their fingers too numb to operate controls effectively. The fundamental problem facing Japanese pilots transcended simple altitude numbers and delved into the basic physics of aircraft engine performance. Aircraft engines lose power as air density decreases with altitude, a universal law of physics that no amount of determination could overcome. The B-29's turbo-supercharged Radar 3350 engines maintained sea-level power up to their critical altitude through General Electric Type B-11 turbochargers that used exhaust gases to compress intake air, essentially bringing sea-level air density to high altitude. Japanese aircraft engines, lacking effective turbo-supercharging, lost power progressively with altitude, leaving their pilots gasping for hot air and power in the thin atmosphere above 25,000 feet. Due to the extreme difficulty of intercepting and destroying B-29s through conventional means, Japanese fighter pilots increasingly perceived their efforts as futile, leading to desperate measures that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Beginning in August 1944, Japanese aircraft occasionally conducted suicide ramming attacks on B-29s, and several specialized kamikaze fighter units were established in October specifically for this purpose. By the war's end, these ramming tactics had destroyed 9 B-29s and damaged another 13, but at the cost of 21 fighters and their irreplaceable pilots, an exchange rate that Japan could not sustain. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, provided comprehensive analysis that validated the B-29's devastating effectiveness. Over the course of the campaign, B-29s flew 31,387 sorties against Japan, dropping 169,676 tons of bombs while suffering total losses of only 414 aircraft, a remarkably low loss rate of just 1.3%. Even more telling, Japanese fighters accounted for only a small fraction of these losses, with most B-29s lost to mechanical failure, weather, or operational accidents rather than enemy action. The altitude advantage had proven so decisive that Japanese air defense became largely irrelevant to American bombing operations. The altitude crisis sparked frantic attempts at technological solutions within Japanese aircraft design bureaus, but time and resources were running short. The 244th Sentai under Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi pioneered organized ramming attacks against B-29s on December 3, 1944, claiming 6 B-29s destroyed through deliberate collisions, with all Japanese pilots reportedly surviving by bailing out after impact. This extreme tactic arose from the simple fact that conventional interception at B-29 altitudes was nearly impossible, forcing pilots to resort to medieval tactics in an age of technological warfare. Major Kobayashi, who became the youngest Sentai leader in the Japanese Army Air Force when he took command of the 244th Sentai in November 1944, achieved 5 confirmed kills during his brief career, including 3 B-29s. However, these victories came through ramming attacks and low-altitude interceptions during the later incendiary campaigns, not through conventional high-altitude combat. His success, limited as it was, highlighted the desperate measures required to engage an enemy that operated beyond the reach of conventional tactics. Japanese military designers developed several experimental high-altitude interceptors in desperate attempts to address the altitude gap, but these efforts proved too little, too late. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden was hastily modified with a turbocharger, theoretically capable of reaching 38,000 feet, but the turbocharger proved unreliable in combat conditions, with only 35 turbocharger-equipped variants built before the program was abandoned. The complex system required maintenance expertise that Japan's depleted ground crews could not provide. The Kawasaki Ki-108 featured a pressurized cockpit, representing one of Japan's few attempts at cabin pressurization technology. 4 prototypes were built with great hope and considerable resources, but the program was abandoned after a fatal pressurization system failure during testing killed a test pilot, demonstrating the technological gulf between Japanese and American engineering capabilities. The tragedy highlighted how far Japan lagged behind American technological development and how little time remained to close the gap. The Tachikawa Ki-94 was designed specifically for high-altitude interception, featuring both a pressurized cockpit and turbocharged engine theoretically capable of reaching 45,000 feet. On paper, this aircraft might have challenged B-29 supremacy, but the war ended with only 2 prototypes partially completed, their advanced systems never proven in combat. Like so many Japanese technological solutions, the Ki-94 represented excellent engineering compromised by insufficient time, resources, and manufacturing capability. By late 1944, Japan's aviation fuel supply had deteriorated dramatically, with most aircraft forced to operate on 87-octane fuel or lower compared to the 100-octane and later 115-octane fuel used by American aircraft. This difference proved catastrophic at altitude, where engines required maximum performance to maintain power in thin air. Lower-octane fuel caused engine knock and detonation, forcing pilots to reduce throttle settings to prevent engine destruction, further reducing their already inadequate climb performance and making interception even more impossible. Climbing to interception altitude required 3 times normal fuel consumption, creating an impossible tactical situation for Japanese defenders. Many fighters exhausted their fuel reserves before reaching B-29 altitude, while others achieved interception altitude but had only minutes of combat time before being forced to break off engagement and glide back to base with empty tanks. The fuel shortage created a vicious cycle where attempts at interception consumed irreplaceable resources while achieving minimal results, steadily degrading Japanese defensive capability. Japanese pilots encountered another shocking reality during their desperate interception attempts: the jet stream. B-29s flying from the Marianas discovered these high-altitude winds, which could exceed 200 miles per hour, and American navigators quickly learned to use them to their advantage. For Japanese interceptors, these powerful winds represented an insurmountable obstacle that made interception virtually impossible, even when they managed to reach the proper altitude. Due to jet stream effects at high altitude, which scattered bomb drops and made precision bombing highly inaccurate, B-29s operating with the jet stream sometimes achieved ground speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Japanese fighters struggling to climb against these powerful winds appeared to stand motionless in comparison, their pilots watching helplessly as American bombers raced overhead at speeds that made interception geometrically impossible. The jet stream's existence had been theorized by Japanese meteorologists, but they lacked the high-altitude capability necessary to study or measure it effectively, leaving their pilots unprepared for this natural phenomenon. When Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, he revolutionized B-29 tactics with characteristic boldness and innovative thinking. On the night of March 9-10, 1945, he sent 334 B-29s against Tokyo at altitudes of just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, abandoning high-altitude precision bombing in favor of low-altitude area attacks using incendiary weapons. This tactical shift might have given Japanese fighters their long-awaited opportunity to engage on equal terms, but it presented entirely different challenges that proved equally insurmountable. Surprisingly, the Americans suffered few losses from Japanese fighters during these night raids, which continued from March 1945 until the war's end. Japanese night fighter capability proved primitive and inadequate for the task. Most pilots lacked instrument flying training necessary for night operations, and ground controllers lacked effective radar guidance systems to direct interceptions in darkness. The technological gap that had prevented effective high-altitude interception now manifested itself in the realm of night combat, leaving Japanese defenders equally helpless regardless of altitude. The March 9-10 raid against Tokyo destroyed 267,000 buildings and consumed 25% of the city in a firestorm that could be seen for hundreds of miles. Of the 334 B-29s that participated in the attack, only 14 were lost, and most of these casualties resulted from violent updrafts created by the massive firestorm rather than enemy action. The raid killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single night, demonstrating that B-29s could operate with near impunity regardless of altitude, tactics, or time of day. Japanese air defense had become completely irrelevant to American bombing operations. By early 1945, Japan's ability to mount any effective high-altitude interceptions had completely degraded due to cascading failures across all aspects of their air defense system. Aircraft maintenance standards collapsed due to critical shortages of spare parts, specialized tools, and experienced mechanics capable of servicing increasingly complex aircraft systems. Pilot training programs, once rigorous 2-year courses that produced skilled aviators, were shortened to desperate 3-month programs that produced pilots incapable of the complex skills required for high-altitude interception combat. Japanese resistance to air raids decreased sharply from April 1945 onward, as organizational dysfunction compounded technical inadequacy. On April 15th, the Japanese Army Air Force and Japanese Navy Air Defense units were belatedly placed under unified command when the Air General Army was formed under General Masakazu Kawab. However, by this time, the fighter force's effectiveness had been so thoroughly destroyed that unified command could not restore meaningful defensive capability. The institutional changes came too late to influence the war's outcome. The 343rd Naval Air Group, formed in December 1944 under Captain Minoru Genda specifically for homeland defense, assembled Japan's surviving aces flying the best available fighters in a final attempt to create effective high-altitude interception capability. These experienced pilots, flying Japan's most advanced aircraft, represented the nation's last hope for meaningful air defense. Yet even these elite aviators could not overcome the fundamental laws of physics that prevented effective interception at B-29 operational altitudes. Skill and experience proved inadequate substitutes for technological capability. The situation became completely hopeless when P-51 Mustangs began escorting B-29s from Iwo Jima in April 1945, adding another layer of protection to bombers that were already virtually untouchable. On April 7th, the first B-29 raid escorted by Iwo Jima-based P-51 Mustang very long-range fighters from the 7th Fighter Command encountered Japanese defenders, who now faced not only unreachable bombers but also superior escort fighters operating at altitudes where Japanese interceptors could barely function. The Americans claimed 101 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 2 P-51s and 7 B-29s, demonstrating the complete collapse of Japanese air defense capability. The improvement in bombing accuracy told the story of Japan's declining resistance more clearly than any combat report. In November 1944, only 20% of airborne B-29s successfully bombed their primary targets, while another 20% failed to bomb any target at all due to navigation errors, mechanical problems, and occasional fighter interference. By March 1945, 85% of B-29s were successfully bombing their primary targets, and by July 1945, this percentage had climbed to a remarkable 94%. This dramatic improvement resulted partly from eliminated Japanese fighter opposition and improved American tactics, but primarily from the complete collapse of effective Japanese air defense. The ultimate demonstration of altitude superiority came with the atomic bomb missions, which proceeded without any meaningful Japanese opposition. Practice missions by the 509th Composite Group flew at 30,000 feet, beyond the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns, and Japanese fighters made no serious attempts to intercept these aircraft. The defenders had learned through bitter experience that interception at such altitudes was virtually impossible, and their remaining aircraft were too valuable to waste on futile gestures. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima from 31,600 feet, proceeding to target without fighter opposition of any kind. 3 days later, on August 9th, Bockscar dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki from 28,900 feet, again encountering no meaningful resistance. Both missions proceeded exactly as planned, with Japanese interceptors unable to reach these altitudes effectively despite the world-changing importance of their cargo. The altitude advantage that had characterized the entire B-29 campaign culminated in these final, decisive attacks. The last air combat of World War II illustrated the confusion and desperation that had come to plague Japanese air defense efforts throughout the campaign. On August 18, 1945, 3 days after Japan's surrender, Saburo Sakai participated in the Japanese Navy's final wartime mission by attacking 2 reconnaissance consolidated B-32 Dominators, which he initially misidentified as B-29 Superfortresses. The encounter occurred at 6,000 meters, approximately 20,000 feet, where Sakai found the aircraft and noted their single vertical stabilizers were enormous and swept upward toward the rear, characteristics that distinguished B-32s from B-29s. This final combat, occurring after Japan had officially surrendered, resulted in the death of Sergeant Anthony Marchioni, who became the last American combat casualty of World War II. The irony was profound. Even after surrender, Japanese pilots continued their desperate attempts to intercept American aircraft, demonstrating how thoroughly the altitude war had traumatized Japan's air defense forces. The psychological impact of 3 years of futile interception attempts had created a reflexive response that continued even after the war's official end. Each B-29 represented technologies that Japan had simply never developed, creating a technological gap that measured not in years, but in decades of industrial development. Constant speed propellers with electric pitch control, turbo-supercharged engines, centralized fire control systems with analog computers, and pressurized cabins with heating and cooling systems, these represented integrated technological solutions that Japanese industry could not match. The industrial gap reflected fundamental differences in manufacturing philosophy and capability. Each B-29 required over 13 tons of aluminum, half a ton of copper, 600,000 rivets, 9.5 miles of electrical wiring, and 2 miles of tubing, all assembled using mass production techniques that Japan had never successfully implemented. While Japanese aircraft were still partially hand-built by skilled craftsmen using traditional methods, American assembly lines produced B-29s using standardized parts and processes that ensured consistency and quality while dramatically reducing production time and cost. By October 1944, 21st Bomber Command units were deployed from Colorado Springs to the Marianas, with total personnel strength reaching 43,000 individuals supporting the B-29 operations. This massive organizational effort demonstrated American logistical superiority as clearly as the B-29s themselves demonstrated technological dominance. The ability to project and sustain such complex operations across thousands of miles of ocean represented a strategic capability that Japan could never match or effectively counter. By August 1945, the 21st Bomber Command had systematically destroyed a substantial percentage of Japanese industry, wrecked the nation's economy, and shattered civilian morale through relentless attacks that Japanese defenders proved unable to prevent. The systematic destruction proceeded through distinct phases, each building upon previous successes while Japanese defensive capability continued to decline. Between November 27 and December 3, 1944, the 21st Bomber Command attacked Tokyo 3 times, with 2 raids targeting the Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino, while the 3rd struck an industrial area using M69 incendiary cluster bombs. These early attacks established the pattern of systematic targeting that would characterize the entire campaign. On February 25, 1945, 172 B-29s dropping incendiaries destroyed 28,000 buildings, proving the devastating effectiveness of incendiary weapons against Japanese urban construction. The campaign against aircraft manufacturing facilities proceeded with methodical precision. On April 2nd, more than 100 B-29 bombers attacked the Nakajima aircraft factory, followed by another attack on April 7th with 101 B-29s striking the same facility. On April 13th, more than 300 B-29s attacked military targets throughout the Tokyo area. These repeated strikes systematically destroyed Japan's ability to produce replacement aircraft or develop new designs, ensuring that defensive capability would continue declining rather than recovering. The bombing campaign targeted Japan's industrial capacity across multiple sectors simultaneously. Aircraft industry raids eliminated Japan's ability to replace combat losses or develop new interceptor designs capable of challenging B-29 operations. The Nakajima plant at Musashino, repeatedly targeted throughout the campaign, never recovered full production capability. Oil refining facilities fell victim to systematic attacks that reduced aviation fuel production to negligible levels by mid-1945, further crippling Japanese air operations. Transportation networks became primary targets as raids on rail yards and ports paralyzed internal distribution of materials and food, creating cascading effects throughout Japanese society. Urban area attacks reached their climax on May 25, 1945. When 464 B-29s bombed the Yamano district, killing 3,352 people and destroying 166,000 buildings. According to Metropolitan Police reports, even Tokyo Station and portions of the Imperial Palace complex suffered damage, demonstrating that no target in Japan lay beyond American reach. The B-29's altitude advantage resulted not from any single revolutionary technology, but from the successful integration of multiple advanced systems into an effective operational capability. This systems integration approach represented a fundamental advance in military technology that Japan could not match with its more traditional engineering methods. Turbocharging technology utilized General Electric Type B-11 turbochargers that used exhaust gases to compress intake air, maintaining engine power at altitude where normally aspirated engines would lose performance. Japan had experimented with turbocharging technology, but lacked the precision metallurgy and manufacturing capability necessary to produce reliable units that could operate effectively under combat conditions for extended periods. Pressurization systems maintained cabin altitude of 8,000 feet even when aircraft operated at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, allowing crews to work effectively without oxygen masks during routine operations. This seemingly simple advantage provided enormous tactical benefits, allowing American crews to remain alert and effective during long missions, while Japanese pilots struggled with oxygen deprivation and extreme cold that degraded their combat performance. Engine technology represented perhaps the most significant advantage, as the Radar 3350 duplex Cyclone produced 2,200 horsepower through 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, with turbocharging maintaining this power output at high altitude. Japanese engines, while reliable and effective at lower altitudes where they had been designed to operate, simply could not match this high-altitude performance despite the skill and dedication of their designers and manufacturers. Fire control systems incorporated analog computers that automatically calculated lead angles and bullet drop, allowing gunners to transfer control of turrets and create coordinated defensive fire patterns that Japanese pilots found lethal even when approaching from below, the only attack angle available given the altitude differential. This automated fire control capability multiplied the effectiveness of defensive armament while reducing the skill requirements for effective gunnery. While technology ultimately determined the campaign's outcome, the human dimension of the altitude war deserves recognition and respect. Japanese pilots displayed extraordinary courage in attempting impossible interceptions, climbing until their engines failed, consciousness faded, and ice covered their aircraft, knowing they likely could never reach their targets. The repeated failure to intercept B-29s at altitude demoralized not only the pilots themselves, but the entire Japanese population, who watched their defenders take off to engage raiders, only to return having never reached combat altitude. The psychological warfare value of B-29s flying unopposed over Japanese cities proved immense, demonstrating Japan's helplessness against air attack more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. Citizens could see with their own eyes that their military could not protect them from American bombers, undermining confidence in ultimate victory and preparing the population psychologically for eventual surrender. Training programs collapsed as the war progressed and resources became scarce. New pilots entered combat with fewer than 100 flight hours compared to over 500 hours for pilots earlier in the war. These hastily trained novices lacked the sophisticated skills required for complex high-altitude operations, making effective interception even more impossible than it had been for experienced pilots flying superior aircraft earlier in the conflict. The maintenance crisis compounded every other problem facing Japanese air defense. By spring 1945, Japan's aircraft availability rate had fallen below 40% as sophisticated high-altitude fighters required precise maintenance that became impossible with critical shortages of spare parts, specialized tools, and experienced mechanics. Engines failed during desperate climb attempts, often with fatal results as pilots attempted to bail out from aircraft with jammed canopies, another maintenance failure that reflected the general degradation of Japanese technical capability. The B-29 campaign's effectiveness extended far beyond simple bomb tonnage delivered to targets. Operating above effective fighter opposition allowed American forces to conduct multiple types of operations that would have been prohibitively costly against competent air defenses. Daylight precision bombing missions, while less accurate than hoped due to jet stream effects, could proceed without prohibitive losses to fighter opposition. Night area bombing missions represented a tactical evolution that devastated Japanese cities while continuing to avoid significant fighter opposition. The shift to low-altitude incendiary raids destroyed urban areas more effectively than high-altitude precision attacks, while maintaining acceptable loss rates. Mining operations saw B-29s drop thousands of naval mines in Japanese coastal waters, effectively blockading the home islands and strangling maritime commerce. These mining missions proceeded virtually unopposed, demonstrating the complete collapse of Japanese air defense capability. Psychological warfare operations included extensive leaflet drops warning civilians of impending raids, demoralizing the population while demonstrating Japan's helplessness against air attack. These leaflet operations served dual purposes, providing humanitarian warnings while undermining civilian morale and confidence in military protection. Reconnaissance missions allowed photo reconnaissance B-29s to map Japanese defenses with complete impunity, providing intelligence for invasion planning that ultimately proved unnecessary when Japan surrendered. The B-29's decisive role in ending the war extended well beyond the atomic bomb missions, though those final attacks provided the dramatic conclusion to a campaign that had already made Japanese defeat inevitable. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast specifically mentioned a new and most cruel bomb, but the context included years of conventional B-29 raids that had already devastated Japan's industrial capacity and civilian morale. The Imperial Conference that decided on surrender discussed at length the impossibility of defending against continued B-29 attacks. Military leaders admitted they could not prevent the systematic destruction of Japan's remaining cities, acknowledging that continued resistance would result only in additional destruction without any realistic hope of changing the war's outcome. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving excuse for surrender, but the conventional B-29 campaign had already made Japan's defeat mathematically certain. As Yutaka Akabane, a senior civil servant, observed after the war, it was the raids on the medium and smaller cities which had the worst effect and really brought home to the people the experience of bombing and demoralization. The systematic destruction of secondary cities demonstrated that no location in Japan lay beyond American reach, creating psychological pressure that proved as effective as physical destruction in breaking Japanese will to continue fighting. By August 1945, Japanese industrial production had fallen to less than 15% of peak wartime levels, with the B-29 campaign serving as the primary cause of this economic collapse. The combination of direct attacks on industrial facilities, destruction of transportation networks, and mining of coastal waters had created a stranglehold that made continued resistance economically impossible even if military forces had remained capable of effective defense. The B-29's altitude advantage over Japanese fighters provides enduring lessons for military strategists studying the relationship between technology and tactics in modern warfare. Domain control, the ability to operate effectively in a realm where enemies cannot respond, provides decisive strategic advantage that can determine campaign outcomes regardless of other factors. The B-29's operation above Japanese fighter ceilings anticipated modern concepts of air superiority and domain dominance that continue to influence military planning today. Technology integration proved more important than individual technological breakthroughs, as victory resulted from combining multiple systems, turbocharging, pressurization, fire control, and navigation, into an effective operational capability rather than relying on any single advanced component. This system's approach to military technology development became a cornerstone of post-war American defense planning and influenced military procurement strategies for decades. Industrial-based capacity ultimately determined military power more than tactical skill or individual courage, as America's ability to produce nearly 4,000 B-29s while maintaining consistent quality demonstrated industrial supremacy that proved as decisive as any battlefield victory. The campaign validated the strategic importance of industrial mobilization and mass production capability in modern warfare, lessons that influenced Cold War defense planning and resource allocation. Training and doctrinal development proved essential for realizing technological potential, as sophisticated systems required extensive crew training and operational procedures to achieve maximum effectiveness. American crews underwent months of intensive training to operate complex B-29 systems effectively, while Japanese pilots received increasingly abbreviated training that left them unprepared for high-altitude combat, even when flying capable aircraft. The B-29 experience profoundly influenced military aviation development for decades following the war's end. The Soviet Union, having reverse-engineered captured B-29s into the Tupolev Tu-4, prioritized high-altitude capability in all subsequent bomber designs, leading to aircraft like the Tu-95 Bear that remained operational into the 21st century. The demonstrated need to intercept high-altitude bombers accelerated jet fighter development worldwide and drove the rapid development of surface-to-air missile systems that would define Cold War air defense strategies. In the decades following the war, former enemies met at aviation reunions and historical conferences, revealing the human dimension of the altitude war through personal accounts and shared memories. Japanese pilots who had attempted futile interceptions met American B-29 crews who had watched their desperate climb attempts from unreachable altitudes above. These meetings revealed unexpected mutual respect born from shared experience of aerial combat, even when conducted at different altitudes. American crews acknowledged the extraordinary courage displayed by Japanese pilots in attempting impossible interceptions, while Japanese veterans admitted they had known from early 1945 that their efforts were futile, but continued flying from duty and shame at any alternative to continued resistance. The shared experience of aerial combat, even at vastly different altitudes, created bonds between former enemies that transcended national boundaries and wartime animosities. The Japanese aviation industry's post-war development reflected lessons learned from the traumatic B-29 experience. Every specification for Japan's post-war self-defense force aircraft emphasized high-altitude performance capability, ensuring that future Japanese fighters could operate effectively at altitudes where B-29s had once flown unopposed. The trauma of being unable to reach attacking bombers influenced Japanese aerospace development philosophy for generations, creating a national determination never again to concede altitude superiority to potential adversaries. The approximately 5,000-foot altitude difference between B-29 cruising altitude and effective Japanese fighter combat ceiling determined the fate of nations and changed the course of world history. Those 3,000 to 5,000 feet of vertical separation meant the difference between effective air defense and helpless observation of systematic destruction. Such small numbers, measured against the vast scale of global conflict, proved decisive in determining victory and defeat. The psychological shock experienced by Japanese pilots when first encountering B-29s at unreachable altitudes evolved through predictable stages that paralleled Japan's broader war experience. Initial disbelief that such operational altitudes were possible gave way to denial that altitude advantage mattered significantly in combat effectiveness. Desperate innovation followed as engineers and pilots sought technological and tactical solutions to overcome the altitude gap, ultimately yielding to resigned acceptance of technological inferiority that could not be overcome through willpower alone. This psychological journey paralleled Japan's national path from confidence in ultimate victory to acceptance of total defeat. The inability to reach B-29s became a metaphor for Japan's broader inability to compete with American industrial and technological capability, undermining faith in spiritual superiority over material advantages that had sustained Japanese morale throughout the earlier phases of the Pacific War. For American forces, the B-29 campaign validated strategic bombing theory while demonstrating the decisive importance of technological superiority in modern warfare. The ability to operate above enemy defenses transformed bombing from costly attrition warfare into systematic destruction with acceptable losses, proving that air power, properly equipped and employed, could be decisive in determining campaign outcomes. The B-29 success must be understood within the broader context of integrated Pacific war strategy rather than as an isolated technological triumph. The altitude advantage proved crucial, but it combined with other strategic factors to ensure decisive victory over Japan's remaining defensive capabilities. The island-hopping campaign provided the essential foundation for B-29 operations by capturing the Mariana Islands, which offered bases within operational range of Japan. Without these forward bases, the altitude advantage would have proven meaningless, as even the most advanced bombers cannot operate effectively beyond their range limitations. The systematic capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam created the strategic platform from which altitude superiority could be effectively employed against Japanese targets. Submarine warfare had already devastated Japanese shipping lanes, preventing raw materials from reaching the factories that B-29s would subsequently destroy. This maritime strangulation campaign created synergistic effects with the bombing campaign, as damaged industrial facilities could not be repaired or rebuilt due to material shortages caused by submarine interdiction of supply routes. The combination of submarine and air campaigns proved more effective than either could have achieved independently. American code-breaking capabilities provided crucial intelligence regarding Japanese fighter deployments and defensive preparations, allowing B-29 mission planners to route bombing formations to avoid the strongest defensive concentrations while targeting the most valuable objectives. This intelligence advantage multiplied the effectiveness of the altitude advantage by ensuring that American bombers encountered the weakest possible opposition during their approach and attack phases. Industrial mobilization demonstrated American comprehensive superiority that extended far beyond aircraft technology to encompass the entire spectrum of military capability. America's ability to simultaneously produce B-29s, train crews, establish forward bases, and supply complex operations across thousands of miles of ocean represented strategic capability that Japan could never match or effectively counter through defensive measures alone. The B-29 campaign succeeded not through technological superiority alone, but as part of an integrated strategy that attacked Japan from multiple directions simultaneously. The altitude advantage multiplied the effectiveness of other strategic initiatives, creating cascading effects that accelerated Japan's defeat beyond what any single campaign element could have achieved. This integration of diverse strategic elements into a cohesive campaign became a model for subsequent American military operations. The B-29 represented a fundamental revolution in military aviation that transcended simple performance improvements to demonstrate that warfare had entered a new technological age where complexity could be made reliable and effective under combat conditions. The aircraft proved that sophisticated systems could be mass-produced and operated reliably in combat environments, overturning previous assumptions about the relationship between complexity and battlefield effectiveness. Systems integration trumped individual technological excellence, as the B-29's combined capabilities proved more effective than the sum of its individual components. This integration approach demonstrated that coordinated technological development could create operational capabilities that exceeded what any single technological breakthrough could achieve, establishing principles that would guide military technology development throughout the Cold War era and beyond. Industrial methods applied to warfare represented a paradigm shift from craft production to assembly line manufacturing of sophisticated weapons systems. The B-29 program demonstrated that complex military equipment could be produced using standardized parts and processes, ensuring consistent quality while dramatically reducing production time and costs. This industrial approach to military production became the foundation for America's post-war defense industrial base. Technology proved capable of rendering traditional military virtues irrelevant when properly developed and employed. The altitude advantage demonstrated that technological superiority could overcome courage, skill, and determination when the technological gap exceeded the enemy's ability to adapt or respond effectively. This revelation influenced all subsequent military development by emphasizing technological advancement over traditional military qualities. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots when B-29s first appeared at unreachable altitudes represented more than tactical surprise. It marked the collision between technological reality and military mythology that had sustained Japanese resistance throughout the Pacific War. The Japanese military had constructed its identity around spiritual superiority, compensating for material disadvantages, believing that determination and courage could overcome enemy technological advantages through superior fighting spirit. The B-29, cruising serenely above the maximum ceiling of Japan's best fighters and pilots, proved this fundamental assumption catastrophically wrong. No amount of spiritual preparation or warrior tradition could overcome the physical laws that prevented Japanese aircraft from reaching B-29 operational altitudes. This technological reality shattered Japanese military mythology more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. Within 9 months of the first operational mission, the B-29 force expanded from a single bomb wing with 119 aircraft to 5 complete wings operating over 1,000 B-29s. This massive force, operating primarily from bases in the Mariana Islands, systematically destroyed Japan's capacity to wage war while suffering minimal losses to enemy action. The rapid expansion demonstrated American industrial and logistical capabilities that Japan could not match or counter effectively. The statistics of the B-29 campaign tell only part of the story behind the numbers. Thousands of Japanese pilots launched on interception missions knowing they likely could not reach their targets, climbing until their engines failed, consciousness faded, and aircraft became uncontrollable, watching helplessly as American bombers proceeded unopposed to destroy their cities and industrial facilities. Japanese pilots, trained in samurai traditions and educated to believe in spiritual superiority over material factors, discovered that courage could not overcome physics, determination could not defeat chemistry, and spirit could not soar above an enemy's superior operational ceiling. The B-29s flying above their maximum altitude represented not merely superior American aircraft, but the triumph of industrial democracy over military authoritarianism and the victory of technological capability over traditional warrior values. The B-29's altitude advantage over Japanese fighters stands as history's clearest example of how a single technological advantage can prove decisive in determining the outcome of military campaigns. Museums today displaying B-29s alongside Japanese fighters tell this story in stark physical terms. American bomber size and complexity contrasted against Japanese fighter relative simplicity, traditional design yielding to industrial innovation, and individual craftsmanship overcome by mass production techniques. Modern military planners continue studying the B-29 campaign and as a perfect historical example of asymmetric advantage in warfare. When one side can operate effectively in a domain the other cannot contest, whether altitude, space, electromagnetic spectrum, or cyberspace, traditional measures of military superiority become irrelevant to campaign outcomes. The principles demonstrated in the Pacific skies continue influencing military planning and procurement decisions in the 21st century. The shocking realization by Japanese pilots that they simply could not reach B-29s at cruising altitude marked the moment when the Pacific War's outcome became inevitable, regardless of continued resistance or tactical successes at lower altitudes. The technological gap had created an insurmountable strategic disadvantage that no amount of courage or innovation could overcome within the time frame available before Japan's complete defeat. The legacy of the B-29 altitude advantage endures in modern military doctrine that emphasizes maintaining technological superiority and operating in domains where potential adversaries cannot respond effectively. The aircraft's success validated the strategic importance of research and development, industrial capacity, and systems integration in determining military effectiveness under modern combat conditions. The B-29s flying above Japanese fighter operational ceilings were not merely conducting bombing raids against industrial and urban targets. They were demonstrating a new paradigm of warfare where technology trumps tradition, industrial capacity defeats ideology, and scientific advancement overcomes philosophical commitment. The altitude advantage represented the future of military conflict, where victory belongs not necessarily to the brave, but to those who can operate effectively where their enemies cannot reach or respond. The Japanese pilots who experienced profound shock when B-29s first appeared at unreachable altitudes were witnessing the future of warfare unfold above them. Their extraordinary courage in attempting impossible interceptions deserves historical recognition and respect, but their failure was predetermined by technological realities that no amount of determination could overcome. In those futile climbs toward unreachable bombers, they experienced the defining characteristic of modern military conflict: victory determined by technological capability rather than individual courage or skill. The story of Japanese pilots unable to reach B-29s at operational altitude ultimately represents a human tragedy wrapped within a technological triumph. Young men on both sides found themselves caught in a conflict whose outcome was determined by industrial capacity and engineering capability rather than personal courage, individual skill, or warrior traditions that had defined military service for centuries. The B-29s flying serenely above desperate Japanese interceptors became the perfect metaphor for the entire Pacific War. American technological capability operating beyond the reach of Japanese response, delivering inevitable victory through industrial supremacy and systematic application of advanced military technology. The altitude advantage represented in microcosm the broader technological and industrial advantages that determined the war's outcome. That moment of shock, that terrible instant of realization when Japanese pilots understood they could not reach the B-29s, systematically destroying their homeland, echoes through military history as a profound reminder that technological superiority can render traditional military virtues irrelevant in determining campaign outcomes. The lesson remains relevant for modern military planners facing rapidly evolving technological challenges and emerging domains of military competition. The B-29s did not merely fly above Japanese fighter operational ceilings. They soared above an entire worldview that believed spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantages through determination and sacrifice. In those unreachable altitudes where American bombers operated with impunity, the age of industrial warfare definitively triumphed over the age of individual warriors, writing the future of military conflict in vapor trails across the stratosphere, while below, brave pilots climbed desperately toward enemies they could never reach.